Hey everybody, Aaron Cowan, Sage Dynamics. In this video, we're going to talk about off-axis sights for rifles. Off-axis sights come in a lot of flavors, a lot of different configurations. This particular one I have on my PWS is an RMR from Trijicon. It's the 1 MOA RMR. But you can also have traditional iron sights that are just set to that 45-degree off-axis that allow you to transition from a 12 o'clock mounted optic to a 45-degree mounted optic in the event that you need backup sights, or if, in this case, I have this this Leopold Mark 6. If I'm out on 6 power and I need to take a closer shot and I'm worried about field of vision and everything like that, I can just transition to that 45-degree off-axis optic, make that shot effortlessly, minimal degree in transition. In fact, it would take me more time to come back and crank down to 1 and then reacquire, or even stay on it and crank down to 1, than it would just to roll the gun out and pick up that off-axis sight. So that's one of the reasons for them. You see them, guys that shoot 3-gun a lot use them, so they don't have to make those adjustments, saves for time. That's kind of a competition factor thing, but time is time. So for self-defense guns, depending on what your purpose of your rifle is, be it military, law enforcement, self-defense, having an off-axis sight might be something you want to consider, but there are some particular difficulties, or well, I guess difficulty probably the best term for it, when it comes to using off-axis sights, especially when it comes to zeroing. Now, when you zero an off-axis sight, be it a traditional iron sight setup or an actual optic like this RMR, I've seen some people use T1s and things like that, you have to zero it on the exact same plane of the optic. You can't zero it at 12 o'clock, so I wouldn't shoot like this using my off-axis and zero that way. That's just not really going to work for what I want it to do. It's got to be zeroed on the same plane it's probably going to be fired from. Obviously, the difficulty with that is if you've never messed with one of these, you pick it up, you get your cheek weld, you roll out, it kind of resets where your cheek weld is necessarily going to be depending on the kind of stock you use. And another issue is when you're actually setting the gun up to zero it, if you're going to bag it, that can cause a potential issue where you're not quite at that 45-degree angle every single time you take a shot. So you constantly have to check your horizon. There's a really cool way to zero these. It looks really stupid, but it actually works really, really well. And that's attaching a bipod to the firearm on the opposite off-axis. So it'd be 45 degrees opposite. As you'll see here, yeah, it looks really dumb, but it gives me that consistent horizon that I want for the zeroing process. When it comes to just, if you don't have that option, if you don't have a 45-degree offset that you can then attach a bipod to give you that really silly but really functional off-axis zeroing platform, just using a really wide real estate bag or a shooting rest is going to work well. You just have to make sure, confirming on every single shot that you fire, that you do have that horizon at 45 degrees offset from the 12 o'clock. That way you're zeroing consistently. I zero all my off-axis for 5200. Reason being, it's difficult, even with a non-magnified red dot, to get that 100-meter zero comparable to what I'd use on a magnified optic. Because if I have off-axis sights, chances are they're on a rifle that has some sort of magnified optic, be it a 1 to 4, 1 to 6, 3 to 9, whatever. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and zero for that 5200, and I can make the mental switch in my mind if I have to go from my 100-meter zero to my 5200-meter zero. But one thing I'm going to do, and this is what I do anyway, is after I've gotten my 50-meter zero on paper, I'm then going to go ahead and confirm at 200, because I need to make sure. The need for these sights may never actually rise in real life, but I want to make sure if it does, that zero is what it needs to be, because I don't know at what distance I'm going to have to make that shot. So even with a 5200-meter zero on a traditional optic, I always confirm that the zero is in fact for 200 meters at that distance. In this case, I use an 8-inch plate steel. I spray paint it and I go ahead and look at my hits that way. It doesn't have to be super pedantic, even though I normally am pretty pedantic about things like that, because I have to factor in MOA at that distance anyway. Whatever my gun's MOA happens to be inherently with the quality of the barrel and the ammunition I'm using. And of course, I want to zero my off-axis sights, just like my main optic, on the ammunition that's going to be kept in the gun for self-defense purposes. Another concern we have when it comes to using off-axis sights is our cheek weld. I used to be a really big fan of flared stocks, such as your B5, your SOP-mod, things like that. But I kind of got away from them when I just picked up on the fact that when I was actually acquiring my cheek weld, I was having to dip my head ever so slightly and lean over a little bit to get my eye right behind the exit pupil to get my eye where I needed it to actually use the optic. It was a small adjustment that I had to make, but I had to make it every single time. So that flared cheek weld is something I got away with. I started using your more traditional slimline or streamline stocks that don't have that extreme cheek weld. Now, based on your bone structure in your face, that may be something you need. When it comes to transitioning from the 12 o'clock to the off-axis sight, we have to change our cheek weld perceptibly. There has to be a considerable change because of the nature of the way that stocks work. The toe is going to create some issues in the transition depending on your body type, if you're wearing armor, your stock, your length of pull, things of that nature. So we're going to look at that. So as I mount my rifle and pick up my optic, that's great. That's the cheek weld I want. But if I just try to roll the gun to my 45, the toe right here starts to dig into that natural pocket I have in my shoulder. Now, I can force through it, but then it actually introduces stress on the gun and starts to pull the gun in a way that I don't want it to go, or push it in a way that I don't want it to go. I want it to be a natural positioning. Even with this toe, the toe that's on this BCM, and some stocks are worse, some stocks are better. It all depends on the total footprint that you have available to you. So it's going to be rifle specific, or I should say stock specific. I'm mounted on my optic. As I roll, that toe starts to dig in. So what I have to do is either roll my shoulder out of it so I can push past it. As you can see, it's taking fabric of the shirt with it, so it's definitely digging in there. Or I have to kind of unseat the gun and then reseat the gun immediately. So from here to there, I'm pushing and then pulling right back in to reacquire my cheek weld. Near parallax free, such as with the RMR, I'm not going to have cheek weld issues like you might have with the iron sight offsets. That's something you got to check on what you're going to use. Granted, running an optic as opposed to iron sights as your 45 degree is going to be somewhat more expensive, but at the end of the day, if you really need that off axis, it really pays to use a secondary optic versus an iron sight setup. One, there's no two things that I have to worry about, and obviously the second advantage is it can give me a well, it allows me to shoot with one focal plane versus 3 focal planes using a traditional iron sight setup. If the gun is for low light or night vision uses, the reason that I really love the RMR is even under night vision, if I have to, I can still get a cheek weld wearing my nods, look through my RMR and get hits if that's something that I have to do, say my laser stops working or something like that. Now granted, on this rifle I have 3 sightings, well technically 4 sighting systems. I have an IR laser, visible laser, I have my off-axis, and I have my optic. That's kind of overkill, but since these don't weigh a whole lot and I shoot just as much during the day as I do at night, and lasers don't work so well during bright daylight, even the green ones, the off-axis sight's something I want to have. Now your offset sights aren't just for, oh shit, my optic failed. If you need to work under low cover, and this is something I talked about in the past and I've did a specific video on it, I can get the rifle flatter by rolling it out. But if I just have my main 12 o'clock mounted optic, going to have point of aim, point of impact differences based on the way that just ballistics work. So having something zeroed to the 45 degree allows me to work under lower cover and maintain within relative to my zero distance a point of aim, point of impact that's going to be easier to factor on the fly than it is if I have to work the math in my head with a traditional zeroed optic. Now getting right into the practical application of the technique, actually going from my 12 o'clock to my off-axis optic. I already kind of talked about it walking through that transition. You may need to reacquire your cheek weld. Based on your body type, length of pull of the rifle, if you have a flared stock or not, the gear you're wearing, and even the backup sights versus the primary optic you're using, you may have to reacquire, readjust your eye relief, any number of factors. So that's obviously something that's going to be very specific on the setup that you're using. But for me, because rolling out makes the toe of that stock dig into that natural pocket in my shoulder, I can shoot that way, I can still do it, but it introduces stress on the rifle that wouldn't normally be there, which is something I don't like. I don't want stress, any kind of directional stress being, or asymmetrical stress being introduced to the rear of the gun, because that's my control point, or one of my control points. So for me, I'm going to roll out, come off, come right back on, get my additional hit. As far as the transition goes, it shouldn't be any different than moving from target to target. The only difference is I'm rolling to a new optic. So that does complicate things. It's something you're not used to. I'm going to go ahead and shoot on this 8-inch steel. I get my primary point of aim, get my hit. Now I have to remember that I'm coming from 100 meter zero to a 5,200 meter zero. So as I roll the gun, I have to account for that in my point of aim, point of impact hold to get my hit. Building speed is another factor, and it's something we definitely need to talk about. speed is obviously going to be relative to the distance to the target. But another thing that can help you build up that transition speed is just getting used to actually making the transition itself, and you can do that without firing a single round. If you're using a low power variable magnification optic, or even a red dot and then off-axis 45 like iron sights, all I need to do is pick my point of aim, whatever that happens to be. I acquire it, and then I practice rolling out, receding, rolling back, rolling out, receding, rolling back, going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And I can even do it between two different points of aim. Say a target that's out at 200 meters, and then I'll use my off axis for a target that's at 50 meters in a different direction. Going back and forth, going back and forth, going back and forth helps me build up just that natural Hebbian plasticity, working that neural pathway, so it's easier for me to make the transition from my traditional optic or my main optic to my backup optic or my backup iron sights much more effortlessly versus something that I don't practice a lot. Getting used to the mechanics of it is how you're going to get the speed. And then you take it to the range and actually practice it, and you'll find that if you practice it a lot dry fire, just working that transition with no rounds fired, once you actually start shooting, a really good foundation of speed's already going to be there. Now, off-axis sights aren't for everybody. If your rifle doesn't need them, then you don't get them. It's not something I would advocate for every single particular setup, based on how you build your rifle or how you set up your optics based on the needs and what your rifle's actually for. For some weapon systems, it just doesn't make sense. Another problem that we have is on some of those magnified optics, if they have a really prominent right side turret, make sure that turret isn't going to block your line of sight on your off-axis optic or your off-axis irons, because then you've just wasted some money. And all things considered, it's easier to not buy those iron sights if they're not going to work. So do some research to find out, make sure it's going to work, because I know on some of my guns I can't run off-axis irons because the prominence of that right side turret is so significant. I'd have to find a way to space it up, and it's just not worth it at that point. So at that point, I'm just going to run a red dot sight off of one of the rings or something like that. So that's definitely something you have to take into consideration. But I think you'll find, if you're willing to explore the off-axis option, it's going to be a faster transition for you from your magnified to your backups, as opposed to trying to dial out. Even with a rat tail or a fox tail, whatever you call it, it's still going to be faster just to roll the gun than it is to remove your support hand from the weapon, dial out of your optic back to your one setting, reacquire your target or your threat, and then press that round. It gives you more data, more history, I should say, with your target versus going through that entire process. It is a little bit more expensive than, say, just running just the optic itself and dialing out when you need to shoot in close, or dialing out when you need to open your field of view. But for guns, for self-defense purposes, patrol rifles and the such, it's definitely something that you should consider. And my personal advice is consider an off-axis optic versus off-axis irons, just because there's not that snag potential you have with that front sight, because it's at that 45-degree angle. And with the mag pulls are great, but you got to fold them up unless you leave them folded up, which is also an option. But then it comes back to that snag issue, and it's 3 focal plane shooting versus 1 focal plane shooting, which is what we always want to have if we have the option. I'm Aaron Cowan with Sage Dynamics. Train accordingly.